radical normal.
Went out into the streets of Stockholm or any city in the world and asked what the word sustainability means, 9 or 10 out of 10 people would say it's about the environment. And of course it is, but it's about so much more. It's about social justice as well. And that is a foundation, I think, that we often forget. And certainly if we look around in best practice databases around the world, and environmental sustainability dominates. 9 or 10 out of 10 people reimagining would say it's about equality, living within limits. But it's about reimagining equality, reimagining justice as well. And that is human equality and environmental equality are often separated. They're seen as separate goals. I want to argue around necessarily if we look around doing so well around the world. Environmental sustainability, 10 out of 10. Reimagining living within equality, reimagining human equality and environmental equality are often separated. Environmental sustainability, 10 out of 10. Reimagining equality, living within limits. Reimagining equality, living within limits. Reimagining is about inclusion and interculturalism, i.e. bringing in different voices into northern discourses. So, reimagining just sustainability is development in an unequal world. What we really wanted to do was to introduce this discourse of equity and justice into inclusion and largely environmentalist discourse. I.e. in the north there was the discourse of environmental justice, but the main policy discourse was around reimagining just sustainability is development in an unequal world. This idea of justice. What we really wanted to do was to introduce this discourse of equity and justice. We really decided that in a largely truly sustainable society, one where welfare was the discourse of environmental justice, but the main policy discourse was around reimagining
Hey, welcome everyone to Radical Normal. I think that was going down the rabbit hole. This is what happens with YouTube when they say that you can't use their videos because of copyright reasons and madness ensues. But we're going to continue without the video because we don't need to see Julian Agyeman lecture. Welcome everyone to Radical Normal. I think that was Max. Can we just welcome him on, and I'll introduce him in person. Hello, Julian. How are you?
Fine, thank you, Damon.
This is Radical Normal. I'm Damon Scranton coming to you from Pasadena, California. Max is coming to you from some undisclosed location on the East Coast. And Julian Agyeman is coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm so glad to have you here today. I apologize for that technical malfunction, whatever that was, but that gives us a little bit more time to talk.
Great.
Can I introduce you really quickly?
Of course you can.
I'm going to start by reading as many books of yours as I can in one breath. Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World, Sustainable Communities and the Challenge of Environmental Justice, the New Countryside, Ethnicity, Nation and Exclusion in Contemporary Rural Britain, Environmental Justice and that's all I can do. Sustainability in the former Soviet Union, Speaking for Ourselves, Environmental Justice in Canada, Environmental Inequalities Beyond Borders, Cultivating Food Justice. You've written a lot of things, and we're going to talk about a few of them. And I also want to list a name of the places where you have lectured and traveled. Tell me if I'm off on any of these. Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, New York, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Dublin, Cape Town, Venice, Copenhagen, Gothenburg, Beijing, Utrecht, Edmonton, Melbourne, Madras, San Francisco, Belfast, Johannesburg, Athens, Canberra, Stockholm, Adelaide, Helsinki, and Belo Horizonte?
Yes.
Where is Belo Horizonte?
Belo Horizonte is in Brazil.
Belo Horizonte.
That's right. Yeah. One of the Brazilian people I was talking to told me it's not Belo Horizonte, it's Belo Horizonte. So, hey, we learned something.
I learned through you. How are you? Greetings to Cambridge.
Thanks, Damon. Well, we're freezing our butts here. We've got about 7 inches of snow frozen on the ground, and we're looking at about another 5 inches tomorrow. So, snow shovel time.
I mean, I do miss the snow, but not the shovels. And you've got Toronto behind you with a nice campfire.
Well, there's a story behind that, of course. The story is that, and to your listeners, it's not my photograph, but to me, it tells the human story. In the fire, we have one of the essential elements that we mastered early along our journey, and in the background, we have the global city, the 21st century city skyline. So I like it because in one photograph, we have both ends of the evolutionary spectrum of humanity.
So I have to take a step back and really properly introduce you as an author and a speaker and an educator and also professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. And that's kind of your life's work, which we're going to talk about because it's wonderful.
Thank you.
Medford, that's where Tufts is, right?
That's the Arts, Sciences and Engineering campus. It's one of 3 campuses of the Tufts University.
This is off the top of my head, but start with the difference between Central Square and Medford, just in terms of urban
Well,
stuff.
Medford, I mean, Central Square is what we might call fully urban, whereas Medford is, I think when Tufts, if you look at the Tufts University website, it talks about Medford as being a suburban campus of Tufts. So it's not traditional, it's old in a suburb, if you like. Yeah.
You also had two other conferences today, right?
Yeah.
Auburn, Montclair, like you're just all over the place.
You know, I mean, I had a flourishing speaking engagement business before COVID, where I used to get on a plane and go to great places and speak. But now, of course, it's all on Zoom. The upside is that I get to speak at places. You know, on the morning I can be speaking to students in Helsinki, and in the afternoon to students in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So, you know, I mean, I prefer to be speaking in person, but Zoom is what we got, and we got to make the best of it.
That's a motto for life these days, right? Got to make the best of it. So I want to talk about I call them the 5 cores of your research. I mean, you have them laid out in so many ways, but I'll do the Rachel Maddow thing, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
1, environmental justice versus sustainability. Like, how do we create a justice in an environmental sense, but then be able to sustain it? 2, spatial justice. How does our environment come into play in terms of that? 3, food justice, culture and identity and how that kind of weaves into everything. 4, culturally inclusive urban spaces, how to bring everyone into the fold into cities. And 5, sharing cities, which is maybe a more Uber concept of cities where resources are shared in a way that is mutually beneficial to everyone. Are those kind of the 5 tenets?
Those are you know, 5 areas that I have researched. There are some other areas that are emerging. I'm very interested in settler colonial theory and how that can be used by urban planners in the United States to understand how our cities are as they are. So, but that's a much newer branch, and there's only one paper that I've written about that. But a book will be on the way at some stage, I'm pretty sure.
Can you elaborate on how they are what they are?
Well, yes, I mean, you know, if you look at the US city, one thing we have to accept is that the US is a settler colonial nation. Now, that's different to colonial nations like, say, Ghana, where my father's from, were visited upon by the Brits, and a date was set for them to decolonize, 1957 in the case of Ghana. Settler colonial nations, the settlers never intended to leave. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States. And so our cities are on the land of those first people. I am speaking to you from the Wampanoag and Massachusetts land of Cambridge, Massachusetts. We've erased their presence. They're still around, the Wampanoag, the Massachusetts people and their descendants, but we've essentially erased their presence. And it's often forgotten that when we think about diversity and difference, that these were the first people. I put a land acknowledgement now in my emails saying that Tufts University's Medford campus is situated on colonized Wampanoag and Massachusetts territory, because I want urban planners to remember that we're not just building on some terra nullius, some land that was free. This was land that was stewarded by other people. When you wander around Boston, for instance, you'll see an African-American trail, but do you see any remnants of the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, any of the people that were on that land? We are disgraceful at remembering and understanding the contribution that they have made to the possibility that we could build cities. So settled colonial theory, I think, is essential to understanding not just what our cities are now, but what they could be. How much voice do the native peoples of, certainly of this area, Massachusetts, how much voice do they have in urban planning? How much emotional memory do they have that's been passed down about landscapes, about points on the land that are sacred, etc. So I'm very keen on looking at this idea of placemaking in urban planning, which is about how do we make places that are authentic? Well, how can we even talk about placemaking when, in actual fact, we're place taking? We're taking places that have been sacred, used, stewarded by those first people. How do we enter a dialogue to rectify those issues? And I say this now because we are at this point, this great reset, this point of a racial reckoning in the United States, that it shouldn't just be about those later those later diasporas of immigrants. It should also be a racial reckoning with First Nations, Native American people.
We're on Hahanagna tribe territory here in Pasadena. That's interesting. So the book, it's an interesting segue. The book that is latest for yours is The Immigrant Food Nexus. Talk a little bit about food sustenance and food justice.
Yeah. Let me talk through. You've got a great quote there.
Yes, please.
It's a great opener.
I love it.
Okay, so this book, The Immigrant Food Nexus, started out actually as an op-ed in the Boston Globe, which myself and my then student, Sidney Giacalone, wrote. And it was in February 2017, so 4 years ago, and it was at the beginning of the Trump presidency. And we wrote that if Mr. Trump carried out his wish to get rid of illegal or undocumented people, that our food system would collapse. Our food system has always been predicated on exploitation. It still is. And so we were really arguing that not that he shouldn't get rid of undocumented workers because the food system would collapse, but that this point in time gave us a moment to think about the role of immigration in food and food in immigration. And so we termed this immigrant food nexus. And the idea here is that we can't talk about immigration policy without talking about food policy, and we can't talk about food policy without talking about immigration policy. So 2 parts to the book. One was this kind of macro scale analysis, but the other, which frankly interested me more, was about immigrant daily food practices, or these things called foodways, from the quote that was up there. Foodways are it's an anthropological term, and foodways are the ways in which food is enrolled in people's lives, is performed in people's lives, not in a nutritional sense, but in a cultural, identity, collective kind of sense. And we got a lot of people writing for this book from immigrant communities, from indigenous communities. And really what we were trying to do was understand the importance of food, not as a nutritional thing, but as a as a cultural thing. And what was really interesting is we really found some new stories. New stories, for instance, about Mexican women in the food system in the United States. We always see Mexican or South American immigrants as being victims, in a sense, in food systems. They are the workers, they are the people who, close to you in California, are farming and yet cannot afford to even buy the produce that they're farming. But what we found was that there were Mexican American women who were organizing cooperatives to support their husbands. They were organizing, special food, cultural food for farm workers in upstate New York. All kinds of stories, and I think this is a bigger thing for me in terms of the importance of challenging narratives. We have narratives about immigrants and immigration, and yet if you go underneath the narratives, if you go behind them, beyond them, you start to find stories of absolute empowerment of immigrants, where they are quietly getting on and doing things that are really quite astonishingly clever, creative, and disruptive as well. And I think that's really what the book is a disruptor. The book is there to disrupt those stories of poor immigrants being completely exploited, although that happens. But we, and I, in my work, I want to reveal stories, narratives that challenge the dominant paradigm. And this book really does that. So when you've read it, Damon, and oh, well, here we go, the quote, this idea of foodways, this idea of the human story, we also evolved this idea that food is the umbilical link between where you're from and where you are now. And that these menus are carried on pieces of paper, in pockets and bags, like identity papers, only meaningful to the beholders, only fully real once cooked and eaten. It's a real eye-opener of challenging this dominant narrative. Yeah,
I absolutely love the image of recipes as immigrant papers. You know what I mean?
Those absolutely. Yeah. Well, this quote is from one of the chapters, and it's from a group of women and a professor at I think it's UConn. These immigrant women who have a collective kitchen and they cook and they teach people to cook. Seriously, the stories around food that you can find, the immigrants, Syrian immigrant women in Toronto teaching classes on Syrian food, and these nights where people will open up their homes, or when they could, and cook, and then somebody else will open up their home and cook. And it illustrates another thing that I hope we're going to get to talk about, and that's the importance of what's called contact theory. The more contact you have with people who are different to you, the more likely you are to be understanding, empathetic, supportive, humble. We need more contact. We are self-sorting as a nation. And one of my roles as an urban planning professor is to look at what are the opportunities to increase contact. So I'm going to jump and talk about those culturally inclusive spaces that we can create, the parks. We can create streetscapes where difference and diversity are integral to those streetscapes. So it's just an idea, but contact theory, I think, Damon, is really important in this world of increasing pulling apart.
I think it's insanely important, and it makes me think it happens on both sides, because I'm on the Tweety, not like you, just a little bit, but Kelly McEnany sends me tweets every once in a while, and I got one today, and I was just like, stop. And it said, like, less, and I like erased her from my Twitter. And after I did it, I was like, well, now I can't hear her voice anymore. She was really annoying me, but maybe I shouldn't have exercised her like that. But it made me feel really good to be like, stop. Talk to me a little bit about food trucks. because I'm from Southern California, so food trucks are a little bit ubiquitous in terms of our culture. You have another book that's really based on food trucks and cultural identity and food.
Yeah, well, food trucks are really interesting to me. In fact, well, look, let's look at the subtitle. From loncheras to lobster love. The original food trucks were loncheras, these lunch trucks in California, but also the Irish construction workers here in Boston and New York. There were and still are the kind of trucks that would bring these big wholesome fatty foods to construction workers, and then there are the immigrants who perhaps can't afford a brick and mortar restaurant, so they start out with a food truck, which is infinitely cheaper. And I got interested because it suddenly dawned on me that, and actually it depends which city you're in, but the majority of food trucks that I see are immigrant owned. Or are representing some form of ethnic cuisine. And it struck me that, most progressive democratic cities say they want to encourage, ethnic and immigrant entrepreneurship. Well, here's the thing to do, back food trucks. Young people love these food trucks. One quote we have in the book is, "Food trucks are magical urbanism on four wheels." I love that quote. They are magical urbanism on four wheels. And in the book, we look at Vancouver, we look at Montreal, we look at Columbus, Ohio, we look at Raleigh, and there's different stories. Every city is different. So the most successful city in terms of food trucks is Portland, Oregon, without a doubt. They've made it an art. And in fact, the chapter on Portland talks about how they contribute to the great gastropolis that is Portland. One of the reasons why Portland is so famous for its food trucks is that there's only 3 or 4 permits you need. In Boston, you need something like 30 permits to run a food truck. So number one, it depends on how the regulatory environment works. Number two, in New York, one of my former students for her PhD thesis found that basically there were 2 types of street food vending, coming from hucksters or trucksters. The hucksters were almost entirely immigrants who were being hounded by public health authorities and the police, whereas the trucksters, the fashionable, trendy trucks, they got the best beats to park their trucks on. They'd get grants. They were seen as part of the creative class, part of a cultural renaissance around food. 2 very different ways of treating food trucks within the same city. In Montreal and Vancouver, the food truck industry is very much used to celebrate multiculturalism. But Montreal was unique in that you had to actually, to get licensed to have a food truck, you had to own a restaurant in Montreal. So lots of stories around food trucks. Oh, and another very interesting one, the Columbus, Ohio case study looked at this one truck that was owned by a married couple. He's African-American, she's Mexican-American. And their racialized and ethnic identities helped them navigate the different neighborhoods that they would go to in Columbus. So fascinating. And this is, again, I go back to this idea of story. And my role as an urban planning academic is to tell different stories so that people pick up on these as different possibilities, different narratives, rather than the tired old narratives that we are living with and unfortunately suffering from.
Time goes by so fast. Let's talk about environmental sustenance for a little bit. Oh, there's that quote. You've done more than any other scholar to emphasize the potential and the relationship between environmental justice and ecological. He's from the University of Sydney. Environmental, what's the book? Environmental Inequalities Beyond Borders. Talk to me a little bit about how this book came about, but help bridge the gap between local and global environmental inequalities.
Right, yeah. Well, this book came about really through precisely what you said the second. We wanted to look at, you know, the well-known and well-documented dumping of toxic wastes in low-income communities in the US, the persistence of what are called LULUs, locally unwanted land uses in low-income and minority communities, the fact that minority communities are often also called food deserts. So this multiplicity of unwanted land uses, and we wanted to really try and see how it came about, but also what the situation was now, because in the early 80s, this is when the first report came out on environmental justice, proving that it was race, not class, that was the main predictive factor of where commercial toxic waste was going to be dumped. And what was interesting in this book, and the reason why we call it environmental inequalities beyond borders, was that in many ways, the success of the environmental justice movement in the US, the movement of people of color, low-income communities, to drive out the polluters, to go for community-based land uses rather than, you know, what was being imposed, that this pollution was being pushed abroad, overseas. And that picture that you can see there in front of you is actually from Ghana. It's the Agbobloshi municipal waste dump in Accra, the capital of Ghana, where kids walk around getting the copper out of old computers from all around the world. And so that picture we thought was beautiful because, you know, all of these computers end up there, and some of them have like University of London or, you know, Berlin Technical University. You can see where these computers are from, and they all end up in a place like that. Or that, you know, a lot of the world's ships are broken up, not in the sophisticated, technologically oriented shipyards of the global north, but in Bangladesh. They're dumped on beaches, and people in flip-flops with no protective gear smash these ships up. So what we really wanted to do was to deepen that story about environmental inequalities beyond borders, how we are outsourcing our horrific toxic wastes, just as we are outsourcing production to China. A great point. I remember about 5 or 6 years ago when China finally took over the US in terms of carbon production. And, you know, the US media was gleeful that it's China's problem. China's doing all of this. But what we in the geography urban planning world said, well, hang on, that's not quite the case. Two things here. Number one, the US is still, along with one or two of the Arab Emirates, the largest per capita producer. China may be the biggest national, but per capita production is still bigger in the US. But second, and probably more significant, was, you know, who is China producing these products for? We can't divorce ourselves from the fact that China is producing all of this stuff to then sell in the West. So that this whole new idea came about the need for collective governance of carbon production, because, you know, it's not China's problem, it's all our problem, but we are, through our insatiable appetite for electronic and other goods, we're purchasing products, and China is taking the rap for carbon production.
We're going to run out of time. Give me the name of a large urban metro area that's really struggling right now environmentally, and why?
Oh, how long have we got?
Yeah, not long.
Right. Kuala Lumpur is sinking. Kuala Lumpur will not be around. Lagos, Nigeria has huge environmental problems. In part, they are geographic, but in part, they are just due to poor city governance. Damon, a better question would be what large metro area is doing something.
That was my follow-up question.
Okay.
These are my notes, by the way.
Okay, so you know. Good. You've taken copious notes. Look, there's many metro areas that are doing good things. They're not doing everything towards what I would call a just sustainability, but they're making strides. Medellin, Colombia, a city of 3-4 million, has a philosophy called social urbanism, where where money is put into poorer neighborhoods first to uplift them. They've developed this metro cable system from the slums on or the informal settlements, the communes on the hills, to bring people down into the valley so that poorer people can get access. They've developed libraries with broadbands that are all over the poorer neighborhoods, maker spaces, community workshops, etc. Remember, Medellin in the 80s, this was where the cocaine cartels were. This was the cocaine capital of the world. It's now one of the smart, functioning cities. Belo Horizonte, I mentioned earlier, has one of the world's most sophisticated food security systems. There's a whole directorate of the city council that looks at food production. The city sets the prices of certain foodstuffs that people on benefits pay at a very low price, and the private sector retailers can sell to anybody else at the market rate. They've got a network in the city of what are called popular restaurants, people's restaurants, where students, low-income people can get good food at a reasonable price. There are many examples of cities that are pushing the envelope in terms of food justice, sustainability, equity, and they can do more, and we need to do more, and we need to ramp it up as well, because we don't have the luxury of time. In fact, I debate with my students, incrementalism is one form of policy change. Let's do a little bit, get the public to accept it, then do a bit more. We don't have the luxury of that incremental approach anymore. We need precipitate change. And this is what I like about things like the Green New Deal, which has a whole radical vision for a transition, transformation, reset to more just and sustainable forms of human existence.
So just and sustainable human existence. Let's circle around and finish with that, because that was kind of that's your first book, Just Sustainabilities.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what a lot of this has grown out of. Let me ask you an Uber question. How do you define that space between intellectual theory and action? It's implicit a little bit in, what's sustainable and what's ideal, but.
Sure. Well, look, I'm a practical academic, or what you might call a pracademic. And as a pracademic, I like to think about and dwell in the real world. That's where I live. I live physically and I live intellectually. All of the work that I do brings theory from anthropology, sociology, geography, urban planning, etc., into the practical policy and planning realm, with the idea, how can we improve people's lives in a just and equitable manner while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems? period. That's what I try to do. And, you know, the ideas of just sustainabilities are absolutely catching on. I mean, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, are really spanning across poverty, across voice and narrative, across gender issues, across the need for obviously environmental protection, protection of the oceans. It's a comprehensive agenda for sustainable development, but rooted in the concept of just sustainabilities.
What do you say to people who say, like, yes, in a utopia, but this is what we have right now?
Well, I say, take a look around at some of the examples of, you know, fabulous equity-based, environmental-based projects that are happening around the world, both the global north and the global south, that are making real impact on people's lives. We have to scale them up and scale them out as well. That's what's happening. I mean, there are some amazing, you know, I've given you examples of, you know, what's happening in Medellin, what's happening in Belo Horizonte, participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, which started in this Brazilian city, but now Cambridge, Boston, Chicago, many big cities in the US have a participatory budget where people are asked, what shall we spend this money on? So this is a move towards a participatory democracy, not simply staying as we are now in a representative democracy.
I forgot to mention before that your original bachelor's in science was in geography and botany.
That's right.
I knew geography, but I didn't know botany.
Well, Damon, you don't really know me, do you? You never took the time to get to know me.
I know.
Yeah, I was always passionate about nature as a kid. That's how I started. Passionate bird watcher. You know, I hate to say, I collected birds' eggs, I collected plants, etc. It's not the proudest moment of my life, but it developed a lifelong passion for environments. Okay, I see the scarf. Oh, that looks like some loser English soccer team, is it?
It's really chilly here in California. It's like,
oh, okay.
It's like 50 degrees, so I needed to put on my
Wednesday. Oh,
yes. Yeah. Actually, we don't have a lot of time, but you're from Hull, right?
Yeah.
Hull City.
Yeah, but you know the joke about Sheffield Wednesday, don't you?
I'm gonna hear it.
Well, Sheffield Wednesday gonna win. So, but anyway, sorry, Damon. Yeah.
Can you make the connection for us? How, like, a biracial kid from Hull City, this hardscrabble working town in England, goes into botany and urban planning and goes through Brixton and then Cambridge, and how did that happen?
You know, I mean, part by design and part serendipity. You know, as a kid, again, I was always into nature. I had pets. I had, you know, we lived just outside Hull in the what would be the old suburban belt of Hull, and very close to beautiful countryside in East Yorkshire, beautiful coastline. So I always had the opportunity to go out and to look at nature. I had great biology and geography teachers, and they really encouraged me. I joined the Young Ornithologists Club of the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, and I went to university, studied botany and geography. I became a geography teacher. I went and did a master's in conservation policy, which looked at not the science of conservation, but the policy. How do we get people to say, you know, we need to get this road closed on our street. We need to make it pedestrian. How do we motivate people to want to make change in their local environment? And then I did a PhD in urban studies. I run my own consulting business in London, and then thought, you know what? I want to be an academic. I really like this. You know, I was already editing a journal with a friend of mine at a university, and the rest is history. You know, and Tufts, I got to say, has provided me for the last 20 years with the most generous, generative medium in which to grow. So it's almost like coming back to botany. You know, I came to Tufts as a seedling, and now, you know, I'm a redwood, a giant redwood.
A giant, you're a sequoia.
I'm a sequoia. Sequoia gigantea, I think.
We should just leave it at that. You know, your underground network is like the largest ecosystem on the planet, right?
Yeah,
those roots.
That's right.
Tying them all together.
And feet firmly on the ground, Damon. Feet firmly on the ground.
And like behind you, CN Tower pointed to the stars.
Pointed to the stars. Absolutely, absolutely.
I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to talk to you. It's been too long.
Absolutely, Damon. We miss you over here on the East Coast.
You know, just shovel some snow for me, and then I'll be in your heart.
I will. I will. Absolutely, absolutely.
Forgive me for 1 second for saying that in 2 weeks, Joanna Sherman, artistic director and founder of Bond Street Theater, is going to be with us. You would actually love her, Julian, because their company has worked in Egypt and Afghanistan and Malaysia and all over the world, bringing arts and theater to people in need of justice, theatrical justice.
That's fantastic, fantastic.
So seriously, thank you. Our check for $27 will be in the mail to you next Wednesday, as soon as I can get it cleared. And
that's great. Thank you, Damon. And thank you to Max as well, our hardworking behind the scenes technician. Max, you're fantastic.
Julie, you don't even know what Max has been going through the last few weeks. So,
well, you did tell me, Damon.
Well, just a little bit. I mean, there's like YouTube meltdowns, and it's like problem on problem on problem.
Good. Okay. Well, Damon, thanks, and you know, appreciate the opportunity to be able to give you some insights into just sustainabilities.
I could listen to you. You're like Morgan Freeman. Like, do some prayer books on tape so I can fall to sleep on you.
Well, hey, if anybody out there is listening, I'm listening too.
Okay, so we're gonna play you out with a video, Radical Normal People, just because that's what we like to do. This is in no way attached to Julian or anything that he has to do, but it made me think of some of the stuff that we were talking about today. So peace, love, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Julian and Max. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Dan.
I woke up to the morning sky first, baby blue just like we rehearsed. When I get up off this ground, I shake leaves back down to the brown, 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 till I'm clean. Then I walk where I'll be shaded by the trees, by a meadow of green, for about a mile. I'm headed to town, 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 in style, with all my favorite colors. with a bitty bluebird fly. In gray clouds or white walls or blue skies, we gon' fly, feel alright. We gon'
Radical normal.